Okay, welcome to today's seminar. Brent is unable to be here right away, as I guess he's probably teaching right now, so most of you know who I am, Ian Sheldon. I'm going to introduce today's speaker. This is a seminar that's put on by the Environmental Policy Initiative, which I guess Brent is in charge of our end of that operation. And obviously this is in AD economics as well. It's a great pleasure. This, I think, over all the years I've chaired or run seminars in the department, I think this is the first time that I've introduced an ex-student, a graduate of ours, Jeff Hopkins. So it's really great to see that as time goes by, our students actually come back to the department to give seminars. Let me give you a brief introduction to Jeff, and then I'll give him the floor. Jeff graduated from here with his PhD in 1998, and actually one of his advisor, Luther Tweeden, is actually here in the audience. So Luther, it's great to see one of your students back in town. I guess Gary Schnicke, one of our former colleagues, was also on Jeff's committee. Jeff right now is principal advisor for international energy and climate policy at Rio Tinto Zinc, and we found out recently we have a mutual interest in the aluminum industry. Notice I pronounced it the American way.
Aluminium.
Aluminium, exactly. Just so that you know, after Jeff graduated, he went to work as an economist for the Economic Research Service at USDA, and I believe you said you worked in the Farm Policy Analysis branch at USDA. And then after that, he went on to be a chief economist for the House Budget Committee before he moved on to work for Rio Tinto Zinc. So he has a lot of connections in DC, still has strong connections here with Ohio State. So Jeff, the floor is yours. Welcome back to Ohio State.
Thank you. It's a pleasure, and I am just really grateful to be able to come back and share what I've been doing. I'm not going to start out with a lot of nice things about the department, even though I could, but I don't want to inhibit anybody from kind of throwing things at me and throwing stones. I don't want to take anybody out of the running by saying nice things, except I will say thank you to Luther for dinner last night. It was very enjoyable, and but I know you wouldn't pass up the opportunity to let your point of view known, so please do so. And feel free to interrupt at any time. If I'm going too fast or you want me to move on, just let me know. Like I said, delighted to be here, and I've been in Washington, D.C. since I left Ohio State, graduated in 1998, and have worked in a number of different areas. Wrote about climate policy when I was at Ohio State. I did some work on soil conservation and introduced the idea of carbon stocks and the value of building carbon stocks and soil carbon. Wrote about that at the time. I don't know if there's still a publication called Ohio's Challenge. There used to be a publication called Ohio's Challenge, and we, with a couple other graduate students, wrote about the connection between agriculture and climate change. Kind of went through the soil conservation story, but also nitrous oxide and methane, and that was really useful. And I think you never know in what way writing and thinking about things and some level of depth is going to help you later on. But that work definitely was something that I could point to that would make me relevant for a mining company like Rio Tinto that had a climate policy position, in the sense that since 2007 they've had a climate policy position which recognized the impact of human activities on climate, and that something should be done about it. And when I joined Rio Tinto, I was essentially replying to an advertisement in Roll Call newspaper, which is a very low circulation Capitol Hill newspaper. It was just an ad in the back that said, we have a position now, what do we do? We need someone to help us to figure out what we should be for. And this was in 2008, and I've been with them ever since. Haven't solved it, but have obviously, but have, I think, gotten a lot of insights into what Rio Tinto should be for in terms of climate policy. So that just as a little bit of antecedent. So I want to get you guys thinking like miners at the beginning. So thinking a little bit in the mindset of we're producing non-renewable resources for consumption in a wide variety of products. So thinking along those lines. Rio Tinto, I don't know if you've heard very much about them. They sounds like the name means colored river. The colored river is in Spain. The Rio Tinto mine was originally in Spain, and it's an old mine. It was even active during Roman times, where they were actually getting copper for use in armaments, and it was used by the Roman army. It's we don't own it any longer. We still use the name, but that's where the name comes from. We're not a Latin American company. We're headquartered in London, and through a series of mergers, we have two headquarters. We're dual listed, so Australian because that's where most of our assets are, and London because that's where the London Metals Exchange is, and most international mining companies have a headquarters or a big presence in London as a result of that. So dual listed aluminium, we call it aluminium on this slide, but essentially a leading position in all aspects, the bauxite, which is mined in the equatorial regions, the alumina, and then the smelting of aluminum, so all aspects of that. Copper, both copper molybdenum, which is used in making stainless steel, diamonds and minerals. This is the areas where we're leaders in. Titanium dioxide, which is a feedstock used in both creation of pigments as well as in metals. Borates, diamonds and salt. Borates are industrial minerals. They have a number of applications, including in energy efficiency. Boron is a soil nutrient, so it's important in palm oil production and food production in general. Salt, energy, uranium, and both kinds of coal, the kind that's used to make steel and the kind that's used to generate electricity. Iron ore, which is mostly traded and recently mostly exported to China. A lot of these commodities are very heavily influenced by Chinese consumption, Chinese demand. And to be thinking about this range of products, this is just a slide that is showing the percent of, let's say, maximum consumption of these commodities and income, per capita income, along the horizontal axis. And it's just showing, it's put in terms of global GDP, but it holds at the country level as well. Some of these commodities will be very important in terms of demand when countries are in their industrialization phase. So certainly steel and copper, when you're building out your infrastructure, you're going to have very high demand and top out pretty early in terms of those commodities, whereas others throughout the income growth cycle, you'll still be increasing over time. Aluminum tends to be pretty expensive to consume at low income levels, but its properties, infinite recyclability, its use in transportation, lightweighting, and use in a lot of transportation applications, including railroads and everything, keeps it growing throughout the cycle. So we didn't want to be just in this part of the business. We wanted to be in all parts of it, and diamonds is probably the extreme example. But there is quite a bit of variation here, And even within a country, you might have some parts that are consuming a lot of steel, and some other, like particularly you look at China, all the different provinces of China, some of them are still growing very rapidly. Some of them are maybe even overbuilt. But this is what we're thinking. What is our future place in the world going forward, and where are the sources of demand going to be? This is more conceptual. Rio Tinto operates. These are all of our businesses. The yellow ones are aluminum, and Ian and I were talking about the aluminum sector. You basically smelt aluminum wherever you have excess or cheap power, and that power can come from any source. In France, we smelt aluminum from nuclear power because they have a lot of nuclear power generation, and it's kind of set aside for aluminum. In Quebec and British Columbia, it's hydropower. They have hydropower Quebec and hydropower British Columbia. Vast resources that we're able to use. And whereas we used to have an aluminum smelter in Kentucky, and most of our aluminum or all of our aluminum in Australia is coal-fired power. So here's the same commodity, it's observationally equivalent, but it has very different kind of embedded carbon associated with it, depending on how it was produced, how it was smelted, and countries are oftentimes, it's somewhat predetermined how they're going to produce power. Depends on the resources that they have present. So that's aluminum. It's tended to be a low return business since the financial crisis. It never really came back, even though we have that at all levels. The consumption is really growing, so it's an important demand in the U.S. and other places in the world. It's about 6% annual increase year on year, aluminum consumption. A lot of that's lightweighting of vehicles, so there's a lot of aluminum demand, but there's all kinds of supply. So that's particularly bad business to be in right now. The way that we make our money is mostly iron ore, which is produced in Western Australia, and it's very high quality. Essentially, all you have to do is blast it, gather it up, and put it on a ship, and send it to Asia, where it's used in steel making. Probably 80% of our profits come from iron ore these days, so it's a very important commodity for us. And the demand has shifted entirely over the past 10 years. We have one other iron ore mine that's in Newfoundland, Labrador, and they produced iron ore mostly for the U.S. market and for the European market for steel making. And that iron ore now goes to China. So it was never intended to, I mean, it wasn't developed as that being its market, but that's where it goes now. So it's changed quite a bit over the past several years. So that's where we operate. What we're always looking for, and everybody else is always looking for this too. You want something that's large. You want it low cost, you want high quality, and you want it to have a very long life. So we have two main operations in the U.S. right now. There's Kennecott, Utah Copper, which is right outside of Salt Lake City. It's a copper mine, as well as a refinery and smelter. They're producing 99.99% copper. This mine has been around for over 100 years. Just gets deeper, and so long life. And it's also it's a polymetallic deposit, so you're getting gold, silver, and molybdenum at the same time as you're getting copper. So if you look at where they are on the cost curve, the cost of their copper production is pretty much the lowest in the business. So that's the model, and everybody wants that as well. Now,
it just jumps out to me that there's nothing in China.
Yeah.
Is that because the government keeps you out, or there's lack of opportunity?
It's a lack of profitable opportunities, kind of that we don't have that long-lived large asset that we've been able to have. As a joint venture, we're doing some exploration in China, mostly in copper, and I don't know that we've found anything yet. We did own a partial interest in a Chinese aluminum smelter. It was never profitable, and it was really hard to keep track of the money, I understand. So they just got out of it. And China is our biggest market. So we're very interested in what China is doing in terms of their carbon policy, which they are taking actions. And the reason we're interested is definitely going to impact their consumption of our products. And we're also competing with them in aluminum and other commodity products. So if they have costs incurred on them, it could help our competitive position, even though we aren't there. But they're our biggest customer. And they haven't been happy that we aren't there investing as well. So I think in part that was the genesis of the joint venture, was to find ways to invest in Chinese production rather than just selling things to them. Make it more two-way. So more than 80% of our assets are in OECD countries. The last one just had dots, but it wasn't really weighted. But maybe you already got the idea that Australia is our biggest really source of that's where all of our production is. Almost half is in Australia. Those iron ore mines, the aluminum smelters, copper, salt, uranium is produced there, and Canada, where we're mostly in Quebec with iron ore, titanium dioxide, and aluminum. And U.S. only 7%, so that 100-year-old mine in Utah, it is valuable, but relative to everything else, it's not that much. We also have a mine in California. It's a borate mine. It's in the town of Boron, California, that is nearly 100 years old itself. So when we are looking to put in place mines in OECD countries, one of your main concerns is what people call the social license to operate, which is not like a driver's license. It's really just your relationship that you have with the community, and just the idea that profits and business advantage is shared equally across the community. We've never had an operation that failed because of lack of technical know-how about how to get at a particular resource or how we would process it, or those technical issues are never the stumbling block, because you can always innovate around them. The problems that we've had are where there are community problems. So being located in OECD countries, I think, has made us be slightly more progressive in terms of what our social and sustainability commitments are. And one area where we've distinguished ourselves relative to our peers is our climate policy position. And like I said, we've had one since 2007, and it basically has a few things that we want to see happen. We want whatever policy gets put in place to be sustainable, not a one-shot sort of thing that later gets rolled back. There are problems with that in Australia, and I'm happy to talk about that with people. But we want it to be sustainable, and we want it to be, one of the things to make it sustainable is to be relatively low cost. So take advantage of flexibilities. We think markets are the best way to control greenhouse gases. So we're very interested in promoting markets. So any parts of this map you want to hear more about? We have a big mine in Mongolia. It's called Oyu Tolgoi, and this is a big aspect of that license to operate. When the mine gets up and running, its output is equal to a third of existing GDP. So huge destabilizing impact from getting this mine up and going. The government has had to think quite a bit about what sort of investment agreement they need from us in order to make sure that risk and benefits are shared equally. So that's been a long-standing commitment, and it's a copper mine. It has a lot of potential, but there are a lot of headaches associated with it as well. So I was hired to work on U.S. federal climate policy, and you may have noticed we don't really have one. So what have I been doing? Well, I spent a lot of time in 2008, 2009, and 2010 engaging on the federal climate policy process, which at the time was looking at cap and trade. And we were in favor of putting a price on carbon, and cap and trade is one way to do that, might be the best way to do it. So we were very engaged on that, and when at the time, we were the number 3 coal producer in the U.S. We had all these Powder River Basin low sulfur coal assets, which we slowly got rid of. We got out of it, not solely because we thought climate regulation was coming down the road, but other sorts of regulation would probably reduce its profitability before that. Also in the West, all of the Powder River Basin coal is federally owned, and you need to bid for it from the Bureau of Land Management. And they have regulations in place which are trying to stop collusion. It limits the amount of acreage that you can control as a single producer, and that kind of stood in our way, our objective of large, long-lived resources. So that's kind of why we got out of the coal business in the U.S. We're still in Australia. So there has been a lot of progress in putting climate policies in place. It just hasn't been happening in the U.S. and the other area where we're very active, which is in Canada. And those are the 2 areas that I know best. But the blue line is showing over time the share of total emissions that have that occur in jurisdictions that have put a price on carbon. So we didn't really start doing this until 2003 with the EU, the original EU group. Alberta, a province in Canada, was one of the first followers, and we had operations in the EU, none in Alberta. But it was really British Columbia and New Zealand. When British Columbia put in place a carbon tax, it was pretty high. We had an aluminum smelter there, so our emissions increased. So this is global emissions, and right now we're just under a quarter of CO2 globally occurring in jurisdictions with a price on carbon. Now, not all of the CO2 emissions in countries that have carbon prices in place has a price on it. Some part is exempt. Like the EU only covers about 45% of their total CO2 emissions with their EU ETS, their emissions trading system. So if you take the number that's actually got a price on it, it's more like 10% than 25%. But still a significant amount and increasing over time. Now the red line is the share of Rio Tinto emissions. We have 41 million tons globally, and we're more like 70% of our emissions occur in jurisdictions with a price on carbon that we're subject to, with particular provisions that are favorable to us to make the policy work for us and for the government, but much higher percentage than average. So this is really why we have become engaged in climate policy. We're in the negotiation process throughout all of this, and as I said, we're very interested in the sorts of prices that come about from these systems, and also how you treat tradable commodities, because it was our contention that policies that impose a burden on first movers were not optimal. That all that happens when you impose a policy on a tradable industry, particularly one that's energy intensive, and you're putting a cost on energy, you're promoting or allowing leakage to occur. And leakage is just the case that you impose costs on my business, but I can't pass those costs on to my customer because I'm producing a commodity that has a global price. So if you face a global price, it's hard for me to really make this policy work. The whole idea behind pricing the externality and putting a price on carbon is that everybody pays it, and you see it as a consumer, and you're making choices about how much carbon you're consuming and how much you're paying for it. So it really only works if you're transmitting the price signal along with the commodity. It's got to be part of it. So that's internalizing the externality. And if you're producing a commodity that is globally traded, how is the price going to increase? Well, the only way it would increase is if everybody faces that policy, or if the producer that's on the margin faces that policy. So in order to prevent leakage, you have to address this fragmented policy failure. The failure that the policy won't work, at least for these commodities. So that's our contention, and that's what we engaged on. So for example, this shows the cost curve for all primary aluminum producers in the world. So, and each little wedge is a different smelter. So we're adding up to all of the capacity of production. And this points out the kind of darker blue is one of our competitors, BHP Billiton. They have an aluminum smelter. And the green ones are Chinese smelters. So the way that a miner or commodity producer would look at what price is going to be under this situation, kind of ex ante, what's the price for aluminum going to be? It's going to be at about just a rule of thumb, at about 90% of your total capacity. So the market clearing price for aluminum ex ante is maybe going to be about right here. And these facilities are marginal. They may stick around and produce, or they may drop off. And when Rio Tinto says they want to have large, long life, low cost, they're saying they want to be down here. And it's all about operating the smelters that are here, because you're getting this price for your product, but your costs are down here. This is where you want to be. So if you impose a climate policy, you're essentially changing, shuffling the order of these smelters. And if you manage to impact where the 90th percentile is, or whatever it is, you could actually have a higher price, subject to changes in demand, because price goes up, people may demand marginally less. But that's what you would like to see, and that was the hope of a top-down system where everybody is covered. That you have, all of a sudden you price carbon, everybody has a different carbon footprint in here. Some people are smelting with coal, some are smelting with hydropower. So there's going to be a different impact from that carbon price. But this is going to shuffle, and it may move up. So if you're currently operating a hydropower smelter in Quebec, you might be in a really good position. You might really be for a global price on carbon, with the hope that you see a bump up in aluminum prices in return to your investment in hydropower. So that's what Rio Tinto did in 2008 when we purchased Alcan, which was one of the biggest aluminum companies in the world, and owned 97% of their power was clean hydropower, nuclear, geothermal in Iceland. So that was the idea, that we were making a play for those assets. Now it hasn't panned out because we don't have a global price on carbon, and you don't have that bump up in prices, and you don't have a reshuffling of this order here, and you're not getting to that world at all. So what do you do when you have a bottom-up world instead of a top-down world? A bottom-up world is what we have here you have everybody kind of starting at a different point in time. All these people are first movers, and they're not able to pass their costs through. Passing your costs through essentially means that you have a bump up in the commodity price, allowing you to recoup your costs. So we just made the case that for energy-intensive and trade-exposed industries, ones that are heavily traded, what you needed to do was target them in particular. And during the period of time when we're moving towards a more comprehensive system, you need to have special provisions in place for them to avoid leakage. Now, leakage, I may shut down my facility in regulated jurisdiction, but we haven't changed the global price for that commodity, so you may get some of your marginal smelters taking advantage of the fact that you're leaving. So leakage could result in an increase in emissions, despite the fact that you've done something in the U.S. to address it. It depends on where that production is made up. It could be made up and most people assume it would be made up in China because they have certainly have the capacity. So if we lose a Quebec smelter and a Chinese one replaces it, it's probably going to result in an increase in emissions. Australia the same way. Australia's mostly coal-fired power, so if Australia increases their production, it's likely to be coal-fired power. Now, if you lose an Australian smelter for a Chinese smelter, there might not be any difference in emissions. But there's the leakage of production, the leakage of emissions, which pop up somewhere else, and the leakage of jobs, which is why Congress got interested in addressing this issue. They were worried about job leakage and impacts on domestic industries. So this is just a graph using manufacturing data for the United States, and it's essentially showing cumulative share of all the value of production. And then they're showing the energy intensity. And what they had data on is energy spending as a share of all the shipments. Now you might prefer to have energy spending as a share of all spending, but that isn't reported. They do have energy data, energy spending data, and they have shipment data. So the idea that they came up with is that there's a way to target these very energy-intensive industries in a way that would and put provisions in place so that these guys don't leave, so they don't go away, so they don't shut down or maybe cease to have any investment made in them. So that's the leakage issue. And they said there's about 90% of manufacturing is less than 5% energy intensive. So by targeting just this tail, just this 10% of your total value of the manufacturing sector, you could, in a sense, shield them from leakage, thinking that 5% was a good cutoff. And this comes from a report that, an interagency report that USDA put together. And this is another chart that kind of made the point again on the heterogeneity of the sector. Okay, so this is again showing energy intensity, which is what I just talked about, energy intensity, the spending as a share of total sales. And this is the trade intensity, and that wasn't there before. But there's some commodities that are very heavily traded and therefore particularly exposed to leakage because you could have a U.S. Producer shutting down and an importer coming in and taking that market share. Also, you have export-oriented businesses in the U.S., and if they are imposed, if they have costs imposed on them that they can't pass through to their customers, you may lose your export opportunities. So this trade intensity is calculated as the share of imports plus the share of exports in order to take in both sides, divided by the total amount of production plus the imports. So the size of the total internal economy, the part that's traded, either imports or exports. So highly trade intensive on this end, highly energy intensive on this end. So when they were coming up with the criteria for targeting these special provisions, they focused on this part of the economy, which is relatively small. The size of the bubble is the number of emissions. So they essentially wanted to target this. This is alumina refining and aluminum smelting. There's kind of the poster child for energy-intensive, trade-exposed industries. So it's a good one to study. Just because of where they are. So this is copper smelting and refining. So this is our mine in Kennecott, Utah Copper, and this is copper mining. For some reason, they took this sector and they said there's copper mining and there's copper smelting and refining, and those are two separate activities. Even though they all took place under the same, inside the fence in our operation, they were treated as separate industries for historical reasons. I could never quite figure it out. So my objective, my task as a lobbyist, was to convince people that copper mining down here, which was certainly energy efficient but not trade exposed, combined with copper smelting and refining, which was heavily traded but not energy intensive, was the same thing. And that if you combine this sector with this sector, as they always are, that it's in this zone of energy intensive and trade exposed. So that was my crowning accomplishment as a lobbyist, was to convince people that that is the case, and that we ought to be eligible for these EITE provisions, energy intensive and trade exposed. Now, as you know, Waxman-Markey never passed. So it got out of the House and it never even came to a vote for the Senate. But every other jurisdiction that we're participating in has used a similar thought process and a similar criteria to determine what sort of treatment should be in place for energy-intensive and trade-exposed industries. So we had a great preview of the battles that were to come and how to build a kind of a coalition along these lines. So I learned a lot from that experience. And essentially what we've come up with is that for these industries, the way to address and shield them from the policy failure that you're exposing them to is to give them free allowances. So under cap and trade, you have to submit a ton of allowances for every ton of emission, one allowance for every ton of emission. And if you get some of them for free, then you don't have to pass through all of those compliance costs onto your customers. In fact, you may not have to pass any, depending on how many you get for free. But it wasn't proper to just give people as many allowances as they needed, because then they wouldn't pay attention to conservation, they wouldn't abate emissions on their own. There were a lot of bad incentives associated with just giving them as much as they wanted. Plus there was a cap, so there was a fixed number of allowances that were available, and everybody was fighting over them. So you had to have a pretty strong argument for getting free allowances in the first place, and we found that really every jurisdiction that has dealt with this has used a version of this formula. And essentially what they've done is giving you allowances based on your production, because that was very important for policymakers, that you wouldn't penalize industries that were naturally growing because they had a competitive advantage. So it should be scalable with production. In Waxman-Markey, they called it output-based rebates. So if you produced more, you got more allowances, but you didn't get more on a per ton basis. That was determined by a benchmark. And so direct emissions, scope 1 emissions, are emissions associated with combusting fossil fuels on site. So you're responsible for those, whether it's from fuel combustion or chemical processes. We emit PFCs and CO2 just in the smelting process. It's not related to burning fuels. They're just released, and they're direct emissions. So for every sector, they established a benchmark associated with production, leading practice, something along those lines, leading practice. And then there's, at least for electricity, and really for every sector, or for aluminum, you use a lot of electricity. So another benchmark that people negotiate is what's the carbon intensity of electricity. in Australia, it's mostly coal-fired power, so it's about a ton of CO2 per megawatt hour of production, pretty high. In California, you get about a half a ton of CO2 per megawatt hour because they have a lot of natural gas on their system and they have a lot of renewables. So this can vary quite a bit, the carbon intensity of electricity, and then there's how much electricity you use to produce a ton of product. So it's just the combination of all these factors times production times a percent support rate. Really all jurisdictions have followed this model. And this may be a short-term interim solution, and Ian has some ideas about that this could be replaced eventually, or even from the get-go, with a series of border tax adjustments. And I think that has some merit. I don't think that industry is hugely supportive of it, because we see the existing commodity trade as being pretty fair to begin with, and you're imposing a policy on that commodity trade which creates a distortion, and they probably see it as a more direct remedy to just remove that policy distortion for your traded commodities, and then your local consumers face the global price, as opposed to putting up a border tax adjustment, which would increase the price of domestic consumption relative to competitors. So I think that is the intuition of at least industry, who favor free allowances as opposed to border tariffs. But it varies by industry. The steel industry is very interested in this discussion. The aluminum industry at times has been interested in this discussion.
Do you think the free allowances, though, violates the GATT subsidies discipline?
Yeah, I mean that's
the big question.
That's the big question. Can you do this? Can you compensate producers? Can you compensate domestic industry for costs that you impose on them, which their competitors don't face? Now, my understanding, and we don't have the helpful green box, amber box, red box kind of blue box nomenclature in this support like we do in agriculture. But in my mind, I always think that compensating for, I use the same framework, compensating for conservation of a non-renewable resource, which is air quality, is the equivalent of green box. So as long as you're not overcompensating your domestic producers for the costs that you're imposing on them, you're okay. And these systems are in place in a number of jurisdictions. They've never been challenged, which isn't to say that they aren't challengeable, but they haven't, to my mind. I mean, there are two ways you go about this, and AEP was one of the biggest proponents of border tariffs. Now, AEP wants to see a border tariff in place really just because they're worried about the same thing. They want to keep domestic industry producing because it's a big part of their electric load. So they don't want to lose domestic industry, but they were under the impression that border tariffs were a better and more defensible approach than free allowances. So, but there's really no test yet.
And the beauty of this system is you don't get into the debate about whether the border tax adjustment should be based on domestic carbon emissions or foreign carbon emissions.
Yeah.
I mean, this is clearly based entirely on
domestic
emissions.
Yeah.
I mean, given that it's in column A and column B and column C.
Yeah, that's right. So like I said, every place where we face it, they've dealt with this column A, the benchmark for direct emissions, the benchmark for carbon intensity of electricity, the benchmark for electricity per unit of production, how it scales with production, and the support rate. Sometimes they call industries heavily emissions intensive and trade exposed, sometimes only a little bit. So there's some compensation, assuming they can pass some of their costs through. But this is really, and then the other thing that they do is reduce this support over time. Cap and trade will have a declining cap over time. California cap decreases by a little bit less than 2% per year. So the number of free allowances you get every year scales back by that same amount. The idea is that although you're shielding producers from the full brunt of this policy, you are making them responsive to it at the margin. So that's the idea that you're taking them away over time. And this just summarizes the table. So in all the places that we face carbon policy, they've essentially come up with this energy-intensive trade-exposed industry, and this is starting in 2013. What happens to them between 2013 and 2020? And most jurisdictions are shielding at a level of about 90% and upward going forward, and usually choosing to decline that rate of support. And we have a titanium dioxide mine and smelter in South Africa, and they proposed a carbon tax. And this works under a carbon tax. It doesn't have to be cap and trade only. You just are exempt from a certain percentage of your emissions. So you just don't pay for the first 60% or so. That's what they proposed. And we pointed out to them, these are really advocacy slides. And I'm using them as education, but that's mostly what advocacy is. It's doing education. So we use this slide to point out to the Department of Treasury of South Africa that their level of support is less than what other jurisdictions are providing. And for the most part, we find that jurisdictions like to copy each other. They like to take the ideas that others have put in place. So I did have one final slide that just shows, I haven't talked about climate, the Copenhagen pledge by the U.S. and Canada, so I thought I would just put it in here, just so people have it on their mind. But I've done this every year. Luther Tweeton always said, you ought to do something that you repeat every year, and you can just update it, and it's a good way to keep your in the game a little bit about what's going on. And this is these waterfall charts. Business uses them a lot when they show their financial results, so it's easily understandable by them. And I work on Canada and the U.S. And essentially, what I've done is I've scaled them to 100. Both Canada and the U.S. said they would reduce their emissions by 17% relative to 2005 levels by 2020. So they've essentially both got to get from 100 to 83% by 2020. Okay. The first bar shows where they are right now relative to the 2005 level. And really, both in the U.S. and in Canada, they've had the same sort of success. If success is defined by a recession and all these things have reduced emissions, but they've also put in place several. While they haven't gone and done an economy-wide carbon program, they have addressed transportation emissions and some other rules as well. So U.S. is 4.9% percentage points towards the 17% reduction. Canada is 4.8%. So we've had some success in achieving that. What I'm always interested in looking at is what's the gap. And in the middle bar is what is the BAU forecast what's the BAU forecast for 2020 without any additional policies in place? What's going to happen if neither the U.S. or Canada puts in place further policies or reductions? How much do we give up? And in the U.S., our business as usual forecast is only to increase 0.3% from where we are today. Now, part of that is maybe the state-based renewable portfolio standards. Part of it is switching from coal to natural gas and electricity production because of the price differential, because of the regulations against coal. But we're not giving up that much of what we've done so far. But it's still leaving an 11.8% policy gap. So this is the sort of thing that makes Rio Tinto worry about, what's the next shoe that's going to drop. And I'm happy to talk about that in terms of EPA greenhouse gas standards, or whether we're going to look at renewable portfolio standards or an economy-wide program. Canada's in much worse shape. They're going to give up most of what they've done so far based on their own estimate, and a lot of that is oil and gas production in the oil sands. So they have quite a policy gap to close. compared to us. So that's really all I had, and happy to take questions and talk about any of this further. Lynn?
Practically, how difficult would it be to price carbon to the consumer? It seems simple to me, but is there something I'm missing?
So just have a consumption-based tax rather than production. I think that one of the attractions of the production base, targeting further and further up, is that you have a smaller and smaller number of regulated industries, and you have a much smaller administrative problem in administering the program, particularly if it's like a cap and trade program. But I don't pretend to know how hard it would be. I haven't seen it. China is in favor of it, but I don't know that we have an example yet that we could. This would be like an excise tax, right? Yeah. And the U.S. has lots of experience with excise taxes, and I think that we could be instructive there, particularly in talking to China if they want to put one in place. I think that we could help out. Now, talking to people like Gilbert Metcalf, who's at Tufts and spent a year working for the Treasury Department, his solutions they are not favorable to the. He doesn't hold out any hope for being able to implement a consumption-based carbon tax, or even something like border tariff adjustments. That being able to determine in these observationally equivalent commodities what the embedded carbon is based on upstream production. I think that's a big part of it. Luther?
Some time ago, I looked at the sustainability of agriculture in terms of what we're likely to run short of down the road. And it relates to the mining issue. There's such things as energy, potash, phosphate, and so forth. And at that time, it looked like phosphate was going to be shortest supply. So at that time, the U.S. Geological Survey was saying 60 years. I know those things are highly unreliable. Do you have any thoughts on that? Are we going to run out of something that's pretty essential to agriculture? Sustained production?
Yeah, I don't think so. I think that in something like a fertilizer nutrient where there's very little substitutability across nutrients, that's probably a good test case. One that's gotten a lot more attention is rare earths, and Rio Tinto doesn't mine rare earths. Most of them are produced in China. But what we used to say when we were asked about rare earths and are we going to run out of rare earths and is this a strategic risk, we used to say no. And one of the reasons we said no is these minerals or these metals can be found. They're actually quite plentiful, but they tend to be found in small pockets. We used to be in the talc business, and talc is found in these really small mines. If you go to them, you hardly even know that it's a mine. There's just not the industry. They're found in small pockets, and I think that's probably the case with phosphate as well. That tends to be 60 years of resources because when it's found, it's found in very small places. The borate mine in California, part of the reason that it is still there and has been producing for 100 years is borates are really, really hard to find. If there's any rainfall at all, they tend to dissolve and you can't find them. So we found a source there. It's very low rainfall and that's how we produce it. But if you looked at our reserves, the life of that mine is about 10 or 12 years. So you'd say we're going to run out in 10 or 12 years, but there's more there. They just haven't.
How about the bottom of the ocean? Are there likely to be large reserves of some of these minerals there?
Oh, I'm sure. In the Arctic, there's a lot of Arctic production that is geared up. We haven't gone there, but there is a lot. they're in inhospitable environments. I mean, the Pilbara of Western Australia, you couldn't imagine. You have to fly people in and out. You know, nobody can live there, and it's truck drivers are paid about $200,000 a year, and you know, that's great work. But one of our biggest investments is in driverless haul trucks and driverless trains. So there are ways to innovate around that high cost of some inputs. Yes.
To meet its obligations in countries where carbon is priced, does Rio Tinto buy carbon offsets, and if so, of what type and from whom?
So California, we have bought some carbon offsets, and I think that, and we purchase them from the market. We tend to own a lot of land around mines. You use it as a buffer, and when I wanted to impress people in policy discussions about Rio Tinto being a big player, I would point out to them that we own more land than the Mormon Church in the state of Utah. And they're like, well, that's pretty good. But we never used that land for anything other than a buffer. And you'd say, well, some of this could support trees, some of it could be highly productive, but it is difficult to get, to divert resources from the way that you're making money, which is digging stuff up and selling it. So in California, we've essentially gone to the carbon offset market, and the way they're marketing offsets in California, you're kind of blind to what they are. You don't know if it's a forestry project in California or somewhere else.
And if an offset goes out of business,
Yeah.
do you have to then increase your carbon output? Who monitors that?
Yeah. So California was controversial. They put in what they call the buyer liability provision. So if there's a reversal and you buy an offset, and it turns out that offset, either because they said they were following the protocol and they didn't, you have to come up with a ton of carbon. And people were very upset about buyer liability when it was first introduced, but it hasn't turned out to be really an issue at all, because you know, if they tell me that I'm liable, there's a contract that I can sign, which when I buy the offset from the offset provider and it turns out to be invalidated, they either have to give me another offset or they have to give me an allowance. And that guarantee, contractual, is about $1 per ton. And the cost of California allowances are about $14 a ton. So for a very small cost, you can guarantee that offset against a provision that was put in place to guarantee integrity. So I think there are lots of ways around that.
So,
No, I'm sorry about it.
Just from an industry perspective, how do you respond to the criticism that free emissions in a cap and trade system violate polluter pays?
Yeah, I think what I always try to point out is we're not making an argument that there's market failure here. We believe in the polluter pays. The problem is that one of the concepts of polluter pays is that you make the polluter responsible, but they're allowed to collect compensation from their customers. So the idea of passing the cost through is firmly embedded in polluter pays. It's like you're sticking it to them, but they produce for markets. And if that producer is going to stay in business, they're going to have to pass those costs on, and they're just the ones that are making decisions about how much do I pollute, how much do I reduce, what do I do in terms of offsets. You know, all those decisions, we're in the best position. So we're not against polluter pays. It's just that here the person that would be paying would be us, with no option for passing through the costs. So it's that's the only kind of weasel part to it, is that we're not against polluter pays, but here you have policy failure that keeps the polluter pays principle from playing itself out in a sustainable way. And that seems, I don't know what people are buying. They may just be buying the jobs argument, because they are high They're not a lot of jobs. We're not labor intensive. We're energy intensive, which means that those jobs are well paying. They're highly compensated. So it could be that what they're really looking for. And actually, we got lots of. We were a member of a group called the U.S. Climate Action Partnership, which was 40 companies. It was a U.S.-based 40 companies and 5 environmental NGOs. And the environmental NGOs totally supported the energy-intensive trade-exposed provisions. They didn't think they were problematic on the implementation. Now, some would wade into the policy details and say things like, well, shouldn't we see whether or not the industry is really vulnerable? And we'd say, well, then it's too late once your vulnerability is exposed. So they bought that and didn't really have any issues with it. A lot of environmental NGOs are involved in close relations with labor, so that was part of the kind of what they call the Blue-Green Alliance. So it's the Greens and the labor, blue collar. Yes.
You had mentioned how Rio Tinto tried to buy some assets that used cleaner sources of energy in their smelting. So can you comment as to the mining industry and maybe whatever experience you have in general as to industries moving to use climate legislation in terms of gaining competitive advantage over their competitors?
Yeah, because we're kind of in this compensating phase right now, there's not a whole lot of return to investing in cleaner sources unless you have a really long point of view. Like our acquisition of Alcan in 2008, it was based on, look, they own all this power. They generate power. They own this hydro, and they smelt, and they're going to be very well positioned once carbon prices get put in place. But they haven't been put in place, and where they have been put in place, they've been taken away. So there's really no competitive advantage there. So I think people are responding much more to non-GHG environmental regulation, MACT and CASPER, things for SO2 and NOx and mercury. That's definitely on people's minds.
Are there any more questions?
Yeah.
Since Copenhagen, we've had annual meetings and they meet all the time. And they're supposed to be coming up with something more definitive and regulatory. Are they going to encourage more uniformity in the carbon cap and trade policies, or do you know?
The UNFCCC meetings they're the opposite of this sort of approach. This is very bottom up, and they're top down. And but there are some glimmers of hope and kind of meeting in the middle. And I mean, this can't exist. This bottom up approach, it's not sustainable. So it doesn't address the issue in the way it needs to be addressed. So it's a stopgap measure, and we're certainly looking at countries like the U.S. and countries like Canada putting in place regulations instead of market-based measures. And if everybody was starting out with market-based measures, you could see how linking would be possible. But I don't know how the regulatory approaches really can link up in that way. It's just kind of a pledge and review. Well, we make 17% reduction, and we're going to show you how we got to 17%. It's really on the level of commitments, which I don't think are very compelling, because how do you fact check that the commitments really are being made?
No more questions? Jeff, very much.